Section 3 of Horror Stories by Ada Buisson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Ghost Summons, first published in Belgravia in 1868. Wanted, sir, a patient. It was in the early days of my professional career, when patients were scarce and fees scarcer, and though I was in the act of sitting down to my chop, and had promised myself a glass of steaming punch afterwards, in honour of the Christmas season, I hurried instantly into my surgery. I entered briskly, but no sooner did I catch sight of the figure standing leaning against the counter, than I started back with a strange feeling of horror, which for the life of me I could not comprehend. Never shall I forget the ghastliness of that face. The white horror stamped upon every feature, the agony which seemed to sink the very eyes beneath the contracted brows. It was awful to me to behold, accustomed as I was to scenes of terror. "You seek advice?" I began, with some hesitation. "No, I am not ill." "You require, then—" "Hush!" he interrupted, approaching more nearly, and dropping his already low murmur to a mere whisper. "I believe you are not rich. Would you be willing to earn £1,000? £1,000? His words seemed to burn my very ears. "I should be thankful, if I could do so honestly," I replied with dignity. "What is the service required of me?" A look of intense horror passed over the white face before me, but the blue-black lips answered firmly, "To attend a deathbed." £1,000 to attend a deathbed? Where am I to go, then? Whose is it? "Mine." The voice in which this was said sounded so hollow and distant that involuntarily I shrank back. "Yours? What nonsense! You are not a dying man. You are pale, but you appear perfectly healthy. You—" "Hush!" he interrupted. "I know all this. You cannot be more convinced of my physical health than I am myself. Yet I know that before the clock tolls the first hour after midnight, I shall be a dead man. But—" he shuddered slightly, but stretching out his hand commandingly, motioned me to be silent. "I am but too well informed of what I affirm," he said quietly. "I have received a mysterious summons from the dead. No mortal aid can avail me. I am as doomed as the wretch on whom the judge has passed sentence. I do not come either to seek your advice or to argue the matter with you, but simply to buy your services. I offer you £1,000 to pass the night in my chamber, and witness the scene which takes place. The sum may appear to you extravagant, but I have no further need to count the cost of any gratification, and the spectacle you will have to witness is no common sight of horror." The words, strange as they were spoken calmly enough, but as the last sentence dropped slowly from the livid lips, an expression of such wild horror again passed over the stranger's face, that, in spite of the immense fee, I hesitated to answer. "You fear to trust to the promise of a dead man? See here, and be convinced," he exclaimed eagerly, and the next instant, on the counter between us lay a parchment document, and following the indication of that white muscular hand, I read the words, "And to Mr. Frederick Reed, of 14 High Street, Alton, I bequeath the sum of £1,000 for certain service rendered to me." "I have had that will drawn up within the last 24 hours, and I signed it an hour ago, in the presence of competent witnesses. I am prepared, you see. Now, do you accept my offer, or not?" My answer was to walk across the room and take down my hat, and then lock the door of the surgery communicating with the house. It was a dark, icy cold night, and somehow the courage and determination which the sight of my own name in connection with £1,000 had given me flagged considerably as I found myself hurried along through the silent darkness by a man whose deathbed I was about to attend. He was grimly silent, but as his hand touched mine, in spite of the frost, it felt like a burning coal. On we went, tramp, tramp, through the snow, on, till even I grew weary, and at length on my appalled ear struck the chimes of a church clock, whilst close at hand I distinguished the snowy hillocks of a churchyard. Heavens! Was this awful scene of which I was to be the witness to take place veritably amongst the dead? 11, groaned the doomed man. Gracious God! But 2 hours more, and that ghostly messenger will bring the summons. Come, come, for mercy's sake, let us hasten. There was but a short road separating us now from a wall which surrounded a large mansion, and along this we hastened until we reached a small door. Passing through this, in a few minutes we were stealthily ascending the private staircase to a splendidly furnished apartment, which left no doubt of the wealth of its owner. All was intensely silent, however, through the house, and about this room in particular there was a stillness that, as I gazed around, struck me as almost ghastly. My companion glanced at the clock on the mantel-shelf, and sank into a large chair by the side of the fire with a shudder. "Only an hour and a half longer," he muttered. "Great heaven! I thought I had more fortitude. This horror unmans me." Then, in a fiercer tone, and clutching my arm, he added, "Ha! You mock me, you think me mad, but wait till you see, wait till you see." I put my hand on his wrist, for there was now a fever in his sunken eyes, which checked the superstitious chill which had been gathering over me, and made me hope that, after all, my first suspicion was correct, and that my patient was but the victim of some fearful hallucination. "Mock you?" I answered soothingly. "Far from it. I sympathize intensely with you, and would do much to aid you. You require sleep. Lie down and leave me to watch." He groaned, but rose, and began throwing off his clothes, and, watching my opportunity, I slipped a sleeping powder, which I had managed to put in my pocket before leaving the surgery, into the tumbler of claret that stood beside him. The more I saw, the more I felt convinced that it was the nervous system of my patient which required my attention, and it was with sincere satisfaction I saw him drink the wine, and then stretch himself on the luxurious bed. "Ha!" thought I, as the clock struck 12, and instead of a groan, the deep breathing of the sleeper sounded through the room. "You won't receive any summons tonight, and I may make myself comfortable." Noiselessly, therefore, I replenished the fire, poured myself out a large glass of wine, and, drawing the curtain, so that the firelight should not disturb the sleeper, I put myself in a position to follow his example. How long I slept I know not, but suddenly I aroused with a start and as ghostly a thrill of horror as ever I remember to have felt in my life. Something, what I knew not, seemed near, something nameless, but unutterably awful. I gazed round. The fire emitted a faint blue glow, just sufficient to enable me to see that the room was exactly the same as when I fell asleep, but that the long hand of the clock wanted but 5 minutes of the mysterious hour which was to be the death moment of the summoned man. Was there anything in it, then? Any truth in the strange story he had told? The silence was intense. I could not even hear a breath from the bed, and I was about to rise and approach, when again that awful horror seized me, and at the same moment my eye fell upon the mirror opposite the door, and I saw— Great Heaven! That awful shape! That ghastly mockery of what had been humanity! Was it really a messenger from the buried, quiet dead? It stood there in visible death clothes, but the awful face was ghastly with corruption, and the sunken eyes gleamed forth a green glassy glare, which seemed a veritable blast from the infernal fires below. To move or utter a sound in that hideous presence was impossible, and like a statue I sat and saw that horrid shape move slowly towards the bed. What was the awful scene enacted there, I know not. I heard nothing, except a low, stifled, agonized groan, and I saw the shadow of that ghastly messenger bending over the bed. Whether it was some dreadful but wordless sentence its breathless lips conveyed as it stood there, I know not, but for an instant the shadow of a claw-like hand, from which the third finger was missing, appeared extended over the doomed man's head, and then, as the clock struck one clear silvery stroke, it fell, and a wild shriek rang through the room, a death shriek. I am not given to fainting, but I certainly confess that the next 10 minutes of my existence was a cold blank, and even when I did manage to stagger to my feet, I gazed round, vainly endeavouring to understand the chilly horror which still possessed me. Thank God! The room was rid of that awful presence. I saw that, so, gulping down some wine, I lighted a wax taper and staggered towards the bed. Ah, how I prayed that, after all, I might have been dreaming, and that my own excited imagination had but conjured up some hideous memory of the dissecting room. But one glance was sufficient to answer that. No, the summons had indeed been given and answered. I flashed the light over the dead face, swollen, convulsed still with the death agony, but suddenly I shrank back. Even as I gazed, the expression of the face seemed to change. The blackness faded into a deathly whiteness. The convulsed features relaxed, and, even as if the victim of that dread apparition still lived, a sad solemn smile stole over the pale lips. I was intensely horrified, but still I retained sufficient self-consciousness to be struck professionally by such a phenomenon. Surely there was something more than supernatural agency in all this. Again I scrutinized the dead face, and even the throat and chest, but, with the exception of a tiny pimple on one temple beneath a cluster of hair, not a mark appeared. To look at the corpse, one would have believed that this man had indeed died by the visitation of God, peacefully, whilst sleeping. How long I stood there I know not, but time enough to gather my scattered senses and to reflect that, all things considered, my own position would be very unpleasant if I was found thus unexpectedly in the room of the mysteriously dead man. So, as noiselessly as I could, I made my way out of the house. No one met me on the private staircase. The little door opening into the road was easily unfastened, and thankful indeed was I to feel again the fresh wintry air as I hurried along that road by the churchyard. There was a magnificent funeral soon in that church, and it was said that the young widow of the buried man was inconsolable. And then rumours got abroad of a horrible apparition which had been seen on the night of the death, and it was whispered the young widow was terrified, and insisted upon leaving her splendid mansion. I was too mystified with the whole affair to risk my reputation by saying what I knew, and I should have allowed my share in it to remain for ever buried in oblivion, had I not suddenly heard that the widow, objecting to many of the legacies in the last will of her husband, intended to dispute it on the score of insanity, and then there gradually arose the rumour of his belief in having received a mysterious summons. On this I went to the lawyer, and sent a message to the lady that, as the last person who had attended her husband, I undertook to prove his sanity, and I besought her to grant me an interview, in which I would relate as strange and horrible a story as ear had ever heard. The same evening I received an invitation to go to the mansion. I was ushered immediately into a splendid room, and there, standing before the fire, was the most dazzlingly beautiful young creature I had ever seen. She was very small, but exquisitely made. Had it not been for the dignity of her carriage, I should have believed her a mere child. With a stately bow she advanced, but did not speak. "I come on a strange and painful errand," I began, and then I started, for I happened to glance full into her eyes, and from them down to the small right hand grasping the chair. The wedding ring was on that hand. "I conclude you are the Mr. Reed who requested permission to tell me some absurd ghost story, and whom my late husband mentions here." And as she spoke, she stretched out her left hand towards something, but what I knew not, for my eyes were fixed on that hand. Horror! White and delicate it might be, but it was shaped like a claw, and the third finger was missing. One sentence was enough after that. "Madam, all I can tell you is, that the ghost who summoned your husband was marked by a singular deformity. The third finger of the left hand was missing," I said sternly, and the next instant I had left that beautiful, sinful presence. That will was never disputed. The next morning, too, I received a cheque for £1,000, and the next news I heard of the widow was, that she had herself seen that awful apparition, and had left the mansion immediately. End of section 3. Section 5 of Horror Stories by Ada Buisson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Baron's Coffin. Chapter 2. The Family Feud. "I won't tell you, monsieur," began the old man, "about the grandeur of the old chateau at one time, about the wealth and power of the de Gaulles, and about their long history of wickedness. I dare say Josette has told you enough about all that, but you must try and bear it in mind if you would understand the story of the old Baron's coffin. It was about the year '94, a bloody time, monsieur, when those that deserved it and those that didn't met together at the guillotine, when men were hunted about like wild beasts by wild beasts, when there was no peace or rest or safety in any corner of poor wretched France, when brothers turned against brothers, and parents feared their own children. It was in the very thick of those times that Monsieur Louis was Baron de Gaulle. His father had died when he was but a child, and he came into the money and estates when it would have been much better for him to have been still under the rod of the schoolmaster. He was a tall, fine man, not handsome, but of a figure that looked made for command. He liked commanding, too, commanding not only the servants about him, but his equals, his brother and sisters, his friends and relations, everybody about him. It was an unfortunate temper. But in those times it was dangerous to displease the lower classes, and Monsieur, as he was called, for he had dropped his title like everybody else who cared for his head, had to restrain his temper, at any rate, towards his dependents. Perhaps that made him fiercer towards his brother and sisters. He certainly was a tyrant to them, especially to Monsieur Paul, and no one was much surprised when one morning Monsieur Paul went off to Paris and joined the revolutionary party. He was a very handsome man, as different from his brother as day is from night, but though he had pleasant manners, and kind words for everyone, there was something in his eyes that told you the de Gaulle wickedness had found a hiding place somewhere about him. I don't believe he loved anyone, though he pretended to like his proud tyrannical brother, and to be sorry for his sisters. I don't believe he loved even pretty Mademoiselle Paulina, who almost broke her heart when he went away, and who was the only one of the de Gaulles who will ever get into heaven, if what Monsieur le Curé says is true. From the time Monsieur Paul went to Paris, a change came over Monsieur. He was gloomier than ever, but more civil to those about him, and he seemed to take greater interest in all the bloody work that was going on in the dreadful city. Till that time the family, in spite of its rank and wealth, had fared well enough. They had been forced to yield up some of their property, but otherwise the revolution had done them little injury. It is true, the family consisted of only the 2 brothers and their 3 sisters, and they all lived together in the quiet old chateau, far away from even a village. But in those times seclusion did not ensure safety. Monsieur had always inclined to revolutionary principles. Indeed, the de Gaulles, even in the most flourishing times of the Bourbons, had never been famous for loyalty, and at the commencement of the Revolution he professed open republicanism. He contented himself with professing, however, and abode quietly in his old chateau. I've heard it said that Monsieur Louis was learned, that he read enough to turn his brain, but I know that I never saw him with a book in his hand. He would stay for days in his room, that called the Baron's, but whenever I went in to attend him, he was either sitting gloomily in his chair, or standing staring out of the window, and though books lay scattered about the room, not one did I ever see him touch. Well, monsieur, after Monsieur Paul went to Paris, as I said before, Louis grew gloomier than ever. At first it was a quiet kind of gloom. Then it became restless, and then anxious. We all saw that, for Monsieur Louis was the head of the family, the master of us all, in spite of the revolution, and we used to watch him, and study his face and his temper, as some people do a weather-glass, and somehow, when he looked pleased, the old chateau seemed gayer, and we were all happier, whilst if Monsieur looked cross or sad, it was a dull time for us. After Monsieur Paul went away, there was not a gleam of happiness on Monsieur Louis's face from one end of the week to the other. First he shut himself up in his room, then he took to wandering about the house, coming down among us servants in the kitchen, and going to the rooms of the young ladies. He seemed to hate being alone, though when he was with anyone he never talked. And after that mood passed away, he took to riding about the country, visiting the villages and the nearest towns. Sometimes after these visits he would throw himself off his horse and come striding into the chateau, his breath coming in great gasps, and his eyes rolling fiercely as he looked round on all of us, and he would shout out the last news from Paris as if it were almost maddening him. Poor little Mademoiselle Paulina would creep up to him then and try to soothe him, but he would shake her off and drive her from him, though at other times he would speak to her more kindly than he ever spoke to any other human being. Those were wretched days indeed, monsieur. One day I was helping in the kitchen. There were not many servants about the chateau in those times. Besides, I was a clever cook, and could serve up a dinner which even Monsieur Louis enjoyed. When I heard Monsieur coming along the passage, clanging his spurs on the stones. There's no change for the better in his humour, I thought to myself as I listened. And I was right, for the next moment he put his fierce face into the room, and shouted to me to go to him, as if I were a dog and he my master. "I suppose you'd be frightened to put your nose outside the gates," he exclaimed scornfully. "You wouldn't have the courage to go to Bordeaux." "To Bordeaux, monsieur?" I replied in amazement. "Has monsieur any business for me to do there?" Instead of replying, he fixed on me his stern eyes, as if he would read my very soul. But I bore it without shrinking. I knew I was a faithful servant, and not a coward. Then he stretched out his hand, and as he laid it on my shoulder, I felt that it trembled like a child's. "Antoine," he said, "I believe as far as men can be good and true, in these God-deserted times, you are. I am going to test your fidelity and friendship, and I vow that, if ever the life shall be spared me, I will repay you if you stand by me in this hour of trouble." "Monsieur has only to say what he requires done," I answered quietly. "My family was always faithful to the de Gaulles." He put his arm through mine and led me out to the group of pines standing just to the left of the chateau. Though the sunshine was pouring down like molten gold on the country all round, it was cool as an autumn evening under the shade of the wood, and Monsieur seemed to grow calmer as we walked among the trees. "It's the old story, Antoine," he began, after carefully looking round. "The old story of brotherly hatred and treachery." I started. "Not Monsieur Paul!" I exclaimed. For though I had always liked him better than Monsieur Louis, I distrusted him, and always feared that some day the evil shining through his blue eyes would work its way out somehow. "What?" said Monsieur scornfully. "Have you too been taken in by his false smiles? Perhaps you would rather serve him than me, would you? Speak quickly." His fierceness came back again. He seized my arm, and, with another of those alarmed looks round him, put his other hand in his bosom as if in search of something. "I serve the head of the family," I replied calmly. "I am the servant of the Baron de Gaulle, not of Monsieur Paul." He looked at me again, and then dropping my arm, said, "I will trust you. I must trust you. You know I can reward you if you are faithful, and I think you know my temper well enough to know also that I could and would revenge myself if betrayed." I did indeed, and yet I did not shrink from him. "I have heard from Paris," he said in a quieter tone, "that there is every reason to believe my brother is playing treacherously with me. He hates me, and wants the property. You can guess what he means to do." "Denounce monsieur," I whispered. "I am told that there is someone waiting to see me at Bordeaux, who has a message for me from Paul. Some overtures he wishes to make, I suppose, and I am further told that it will be the worse for me if I do not meet this messenger." Monsieur paused a moment, then he added, "Now, Antoine, if I go—" "Monsieur must not go," I interrupted. "He must send me." "You would not be afraid? Cities are not like the quiet country." "Monsieur, Antoine Bouteilly never knew fear," I replied. "I believe you," he exclaimed. and that is more than I can say to any other man in the world. Antoine, I accept your service. Give me your hand, and swear that, come what will, you will keep faith fast to me, and not be won over by the false smiles and promises of my brother Paul." So, putting my hand in my master's, I swore as he desired. Remember, monsieur, that hand was then the clean hand of a French nobleman. There was only honour in touching it then. End of section 5. Section 1 of Horror Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Horror Stories by Ada Buisson. A Story Told in a Church, Part A. Published in Belgravia in 1867. What shall we do? We are absolutely locked in. Every door is firmly closed, and I believe it is the doing of those dreadful boys who have been trying to frighten us out of our wits all the afternoon with their ghost stories. And Katie Bernard came laughing back to the spot where we were all standing and saying farewell words, after going through the pleasant labour of decking our little church with holly wreaths and shining laurel. Katie was blessed with excellent nerves, and a constitution that defied winter snows and summer heats, and I verily believe that she could have curled herself up in one of the great pews, and slept the long night away, as soundly as in her own white bed in the parsonage. But there were others amongst us, and I confess I was one of them, who already longed for the warmth of a fire, and who moreover began to find the glimmering of the white monuments and strange sculptured faces round about weird and a little ghostly. "The dusk is falling. This is certainly most annoying," exclaimed Miss Montam, Ella Willis's governess, under whose charge we all were. She turned a little pale as she spoke, a rare thing for her, for a more self-possessed person than that handsome Miss Montam I never saw. "What? Are you too afraid of ghosts, Miss Montam?" laughed Katie. "Those boys will be delighted then at the success of their trick." The governess turned almost scornfully. "I do not understand how one can fear that in which one does not believe," she said, "but I confess I have a particular dislike to remain in a church after dusk. It recalls to my mind the most painful story I ever heard." And then turning hastily away, Miss Montam herself went and examined every door, even tried the vestry window. Those dreadful boys, however, had taken infinite care to bar every mode of exit, and even Dora Montam was obliged to admit that nothing could be done, but patiently to submit to imprisonment until our absence should cause anxiety at our various homes, and someone should be sent after us. Meanwhile the twilight was momentarily deepening, and to my mind, at least, those half-wreathed pillars, those white faces peeping out from between the dark laurel, those stone figures on the 2 ancient tombs of Sir Guy and Sir Geoffrey Willis, lying with their legs crossed, began to look very eerie indeed. We grouped ourselves about the seats in the chancel, and for a time talked and even laughed, but somehow, first one voice grew silent, and then another, and at last those grim knights lying beside us were not more silent than we. "Well, I must say, this is a dismal way of spending Christmas Eve," at length sighed Kate Bernard. "We ought to be round the fire now, roasting chestnuts and telling stories." "Telling stories! Ah, what a good idea! Why not amuse ourselves by that now?" exclaimed another voice. Come, Ella, you have travelled. Tell us some of your adventures. I never told a story in my life. No, ask Miss Montam. She has a gift for it. The governess had been sitting a little apart from us, closer to the tombs than we cared to go, but as Ella spoke she raised her face, which she had been leaning on her hands, and even in the fading light I saw that she was deadly pale. "I could not tell a story here," she murmured, "unless— would you like to hear the one of which I just now spoke? It is a terribly painful one, an awful one, but—" There was a universal interruption of, "Never mind! Yes, yes! Tell us that, Miss Montam!" We all knew the strange power the usually silent governess possessed for story-telling. It was the only time indeed she unbent or seemed like other human beings, but when she did condescend to indulge us, she possessed a fascination which none of us could resist, and we all knew that while listening to her we should care very little for the cold or darkness. This was the story she told us. 10 years ago I was 17, and serving my first year as governess pupil at Mrs. Morris's school near Chichester. No, Ella, you need not look pityingly at me, for I was very happy. Mrs. Morris treated me kindly and fairly, and amongst the girls I had friends whom I loved dearly. Besides, Mount Silver, as the place was called, was conducted on the home principle, and there was not one of us who regarded our existence whilst there but as intensely satisfactory and enjoyable. You may imagine that Mrs. Morris could not have been a very rigid schoolmistress, when I tell you that we even received the news that we should be obliged to spend Christmas Day under her roof, with no greater regret than one naturally feels when one finds the pleasure of seeing dear friends suddenly deferred. The Christmas of 10 years ago was the snowiest I remember. Roads were blocked up, even railways were subject to constant stoppages, and it happened that in our part of the country a small river had been so swelled by the snow as to have laid the surrounding ways under water. So, what with one thing and another, Mount Silver lay separated from Chichester, with almost as many difficulties to be overcome in a distance of 20 miles, as if a hemisphere was between them. Many of us were London girls, and the railway being unreachable, our fate was quickly settled. The only two who remained voluntary prisoners were Millicent Power and her cousin Irena Dupont. Millie Power was the niece of the lady of the manor, Lady Jane Power, who, it was believed, intended to make her heiress, and her home lay but a couple of miles from Mount Silver. But Christmas, or any other Mass, was so dull with Lady Jane, who passed her time nursing her cat, knitting, and physicking her various imaginary ailments, that both Millie and Irena no sooner heard that the rest of us would be forced to spend part of the holiday at school than they begged Mrs. Morris to allow them to do the same. I think we were all glad that they did not desert us, though, perhaps, but I must not anticipate. They were our head girls, our leaders, Millie Power by right of age and rank, Irena Dupont by right of her daring spirit and rich beauty. Ah, heavens, how beautiful that girl was! I see her now before me, with her dark glowing eyes, her oval face, the rich southern blood mantling her cheek with every emotion, so fresh, so eager in her enjoyment of her young life and splendid health. She was cousin to Millicent by the mother's side, but, though daughters of 2 sisters, there was not a shadow of resemblance, either in character or feature, between them. Millicent was fair, cold, haughty, proud of her ancient family, a little proud, I sometimes thought, of having money always at her command, and being the heiress of her aunt. But I ought not to make any reproach, for she was a kind friend to me, and it was thanks to Millie's purse that my poor wardrobe could boast anything beyond the very humblest attire. How it was that Irene Dupont lived also under the protection of Lady Jane, I never rightly understood. She was not a penniless orphan, I knew, for she often alluded to her father and his vineyards down in the south of France, but yet she appeared to be in a great measure dependent on Lady Jane, and once or twice I noticed that she gave way to Millicent, proudly, but in a manner that betrayed she had a reason for so doing. Were they fond of each other, those two cousins? Ah, that was a question which none of us could satisfactorily answer then, not even I, who was Milly's bosom friend. They sang together sweetly, rode together, but never by any chance were they known to talk together beyond joining in ordinary conversation, and never did I see Irene give Milly one of those gushing kisses which she bestowed so liberally and gracefully on those she loved amongst us. It was not, however, till the Christmas I am speaking of, that I knew the great obstacle between them to be Milly's jealousy of her cousin's beauty. We were sitting in the schoolroom after tea, as merry a party as could be, in spite of our imprisonment, when Mrs. Morris entered rather abruptly, and with not an altogether satisfied expression of countenance. "Millicent, my dear, I want you in the drawing-room," she said, slowly shutting the door. "Your cousin, Arthur Power, has ridden over perfectly desperate at finding the manor house only presided over by Lady Jane, and he declares that the cold is so intense he really can't face it again tonight, and give him shelter I must. Most improper of him to come to a school for young ladies, I am sure." Millicent's fair face flushed, and a peculiar half-vexed smile curved her lips. "Just like Arthur, he is so inconsiderate," she exclaimed, rising with her work in her hand. "He wanted to come down here, but I would not allow that." "Of course not," said Milly, walking rather hastily towards the door. "Ah, Irene, you may as well come too. But Millicent turned almost abruptly, and with a strange forgetfulness of the respect she usually paid Mrs. Morris, she exclaimed, "What for? Arthur is my cousin, not Irene's. She does not know him even." Irene had risen, and was following, but at those words she dropped back into her corner by the fire, and a smile, half angry, half scornful, passed over her beautiful face. "True," she said quietly. Mrs. Morris looked a little puzzled, but even she sometimes gave way to Miss Power, and so, without further remark, she linked her arm in Milly's, and they left the schoolroom. We were not so discreet as our governess, however, and no sooner had the door closed than there was a general exclamation against Millicent, for Irene was the idol of the school, and then the French girl for an instant seemed to forget the restraint she had always imposed on herself, and lifting up her flushed face, with its rich, angry, glowing eyes, she exclaimed, "Nonsense! You forget Millicent is almost engaged to her cousin Arthur. It was natural she should wish to see him alone." "Or natural, you mean, that she should not wish him to see you," exclaimed someone. But if that was Millicent's wish, she was cruelly disappointed. Mrs. Morris, anxious to make up in some measure for our disappointment, had invited the doctors' and lawyers' families, living in the village close by, with the vicar's nieces, to come and celebrate Christmas Eve in the good old-fashioned manner, and no sooner did Arthur hear of the party than he invited himself to remain for it, and not all Mrs. Morris's hints at impropriety and inconvenience could induce the handsome young officer to dislodge himself. To the excellent lady's intense relief, Mr. Power was a fashionably late riser, and she contrived to dispatch us all the next morning to the church, which we were to assist in decorating before he made his appearance, and I firmly believe, as she watched us all pass out of the garden gate, she thought she had manoeuvred skilfully past all danger until at least the evening. Schoolgirls of 17 and 18 are apt to talk a good deal on those subjects which good Mrs. Morris dreaded so, but I don't think my mind was ever much given that way, and Arthur Power certainly never crossed my thoughts when once I found myself in that ancient church with holly and laurel wreaths, waiting to do justice to all the artistic taste we could muster among us. We were soon scattered over the church, which was a singularly beautiful one, though centuries old, it having belonged to a wealthy monastery, and as usual Milly and I worked together. She was not in a talkative humour, and so we spoke little except about the work, and when she suddenly left me, saying she must have a little exercise to warm her, I scarcely missed her. Alas, that she ever took that ramble! She was not gone long, and when she returned she was out of breath. "What do you think, Dora, I have found?" she began, and then suddenly she paused and looked sharply round, for a man's laugh sounded from the chancel. "That's Arthur, let us go and see," she exclaimed. And we did go, and what we saw was beautiful. Irena mounted on a chair, twining a holly wreath round a cherub's head, and there beside her, gazing up and handing sprays of shining green, stood Arthur Power. 2 other girls were near, but it was Irena Dupont on whom those handsome blue eyes were fixed so earnestly that even our approach was unnoticed. "So you have found us out, Arthur, in spite of Mrs. Morris," Milly exclaimed, with a smile on her lips, but oh, such wildly angry eyes! He turned immediately and held out his hand. "Of course, you know I always manage for myself." "So it seems, even your introductions." "As to that, Miss Dupont is a kind of cousin, you know, and therefore an introduction was unnecessary. Besides, I am making myself so decidedly useful, that even if I have offended against the Covenant, I ought to be forgiven." "And so you shall be if you will mount and finish this for me," interrupted Irena, and before even he could reply, she had jumped lightly down from the chair and joined another group of workers at the other end of the church. Arthur turned and looked after her rather dolefully, and Milly's eyes flashed. End of Section 1.